All Americans have an interest in this, of course, on various levels. Very few national interests are more touching and important than dealing with narcotics within this society. And we certainly are partners with Colombia in that large effort to deal with that particular problem. We certainly have an interest in the prosperity and well-being of Colombia. And if any nation yearns for tranquility, as all peoples do, certainly the people of Colombia do. And we're most interested in what the ambassador identifies as the most important of the aspects of U.S. Colombia relations and his view of them. Ambassador Moreno has a bachelor's degree from Florida Atlantic University, a degree in business administration and economics. His MBA is from the Graduate School of International Management at Thunderbird University, and he was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. The ambassador has been active both in the private sector and the governmental sector in Colombia. He has been president of the leading government corporation within Colombia, where he was an advocate, aggressive advocate of privatization. He also has been the Minister of Development, Economic Development, where market liberalization was a major theme. He's also headed or been associated with as a senior advisor to Colombia's largest financial firm. And also, before becoming ambassador, was a member and associate of a private investment firm specializing in Latin American investments. He became ambassador to the United States in 1998. We're absolutely delighted that he's joining us. It's my great pleasure to present Luis Alberto Moreno.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that introduction. And let me begin by thanking the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, of course, Frank Bird, for this kind invitation to address such a distinguished audience tonight. I want to commend the Council for its internationalist vision and its pivotal role in educating the citizens of this vibrant, multi-ethnic city about issues and topics in international affairs. In today's globalized environment, the work of organizations like the Council are key to fostering strong ties between different peoples and nations and jointly addressing the challenges we all face as inhabitants of this planet. It is refreshing to have the chance to get out of Washington, if only by a few miles and a couple of hours, to talk to businessmen and other community leaders who are in daily first-hand contact with the opportunities and complexities offered by this interconnected world. I want to personally thank all of you for being here tonight and for your interest in my country at a time when headlines and attention are focused, no doubt rightly, on other regions of the globe. I appreciate your taking the time to come and engage in a discussion about Colombia and the challenges we face right here in this hemisphere. I would like to start by giving you a general picture of Colombia. And I want to start by the part of the story that you don't normally hear about in the media. I would like to then give you a brief overview of Colombia's history, of its conflict and troubles, and by addressing the current situation and the challenges we face ahead of us. I will end up with a discussion of Colombia's increasing trade and investment ties with the United States and the potential opportunities that arise for business people and the broader Baltimore community with respect to a free trade agreement between our two nations. I will keep it brief because more than a lecture, I would like to hear your questions and concerns and engage in an open dialogue and discussion. One of the facts that most surprises people that have not been exposed to Colombia is that our country is one of the most stable economies and democracies in Latin America. That seems to contrast sharply with the disarray and turmoil they often hear about in the press. The truth is that in the economic front, Colombia has long proven to be both a steady performant and a high resilient country. A long history of sound macroeconomic management has shielded Colombia from the hyperinflation debt crises and boom cycles that have characterized many nations in Latin America and in the developing world over the past decades. Indeed, since 1925, Colombia has experienced positive economic growth in all but 3 years, a record that is almost unparalleled in the world. Moreover, Colombia has never experienced hyperinflation, a common and devastating phenomenon for Latin American countries. And unlike most of our neighbors and many other developing nations, Colombia has never defaulted on a single dollar of peso debt. Our economic policy has never taken the populist path, and this sound and all times unpopular stance is reflected in the financial market's perception of our country, which remains widely positive despite our security problems. It is also underlined by the fact that the Colombian economy has delivered average growth in per capita terms of 2.3% per year in the last 80 years. This number, while not spectacular, is quite impressive by Latin American standards, particularly in light of Colombia's security problems. On the political front, people are surprised to learn that Colombia is a strong and stable democracy. Power has been transferred peacefully through free and fair elections for more than 45 years, and the constitutional order was only broken once during the 20th century. No other country in South America can boast such a long tradition of democratically elected presidents, legislative bodies, and regional leaders. Moving beyond the economy and politics, Colombia is blessed with much that most people do not know about. On the ethnic front, Colombia is one of the most diverse countries in the Western Hemisphere. The country has 85 different ethnic groups, creating a true melting pot of European, indigenous, and Afro-descendant populations. Colombia is also the only country in South America to have both a Pacific and Caribbean coast. The rugged and scenic Andes Mountains form a geographic spine down the center of Colombia, dividing the country from north to south. A vast majority of the population lives in the fertile valleys of the Andes. In fact, more than 70% of Colombians live in just 10 cities located in that area. The eastern and southern portions of the country are covered with the dense tropical forests of the Amazon. These forests are among the world's most valuable natural resources. They are home to 10% of the world's biodiversity, second only to that of neighboring Brazil. That biodiversity is threatened by the illegal drug trade. Colombians also enjoy a free and vibrant press, some of the best universities in Latin America, and a rich cultural scene. Indeed, our country is a fertile ground for artistic talent. The world's most widely read living novelist is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and one of the most important living painters is Fernando Botero. In the pop music millennium, Colombian stars like Shakira, Carlos Vives, and Juanes have captivated Spanish-speaking audiences everywhere and are increasingly making inroads into English-speaking markets. When you tell people about the positive aspects of Colombia, they immediately ask why most of what they have heard is so negative. The truth is that Colombia is a nation of contrasts, hugely complex and full of nuances. I am tempted to quote Orson Welles in The Third Man, who said, in Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, bloodshed. They produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. But that would be oversimplifying a bit, and more seriously, no consolation to the victims of Colombia's violence. The truth is that Colombia has two faces. One is a country of extraordinary natural beauty and hardworking, warm, and industrious people who succeed at growing some of the world's finest coffee and fresh flowers, who are renowned artists, writers, and musicians. People who have created a stable democracy and a strong growing economy and have courageously stood up to the violence and terrorism of guerrilla groups and drug traffickers. But Colombia is also a country with many problems stemming from a complex and difficult history of violence. Colombia's troubles can begin to be explained by the vast underpopulated frontier land that characterizes the eastern and southern regions of the country. These are difficult to access and have historically had very little, if any, state or government presence in the form of public institutions, roads, schools, and basic utilities. This created a breeding ground for the problems that riddle the country today. The illegal drug trade also explains a good deal of the history of our troubles. Ever since the marijuana trade of the 70s, drug trafficking became deeply rooted in Colombia. The country's long coasts on both oceans, its strategic location, its vast frontier lands to the south and to the east, and the enterprising spirit of its people, this time put to nefarious use, created the optimal conditions for a booming illegal industry. The easy money seduced many young men and women with little opportunities elsewhere. The last 25 years in Colombia have seen a transformation of the drug trade, from marijuana to the big cocaine cartels of the 80s and early 90s, to smaller, more mobile, globalized groups today. At the same time, during the last 2 decades, leftist guerrilla groups, originally with Marxist agendas, abandoned their ideology in all but their rhetoric and turned to the drug trade and terrorist tactics. While other Latin American insurgencies were reaching peaceful settlements with their respective governments following the fall of the Iron Curtain and the cutting aid from the communist countries, groups such as the FARC and their right-wing opponents, the AUC, became involved with the drug trade by protecting illegal crops, labs, and clandestine airstrips. The influx of funds from these illegal businesses greatly enhanced their military capabilities and provided a tremendous disincentive for returning to civilian life. Today, these groups are increasingly sophisticated and deadly. They finance themselves through drug money from consumers around the world and locally by kidnapping and extortion. They indiscriminately attack communities, destroy our infrastructure, and try to intimidate Colombian people with their terror campaign. The situation of Colombia today is such that the FARC, the ELN, and the AUC, all recognized as international terrorist organizations by the U.S. State Department, have placed our long tradition of democracy, economic stability, and our very viability as a nation at risk. These statistics are staggering. Last year, Colombia mourned 26,000 victims of violence. This is 45% more than the total homicides in the United States, a country with a population more than 6 times larger, and it is equivalent to almost 9 times the number of people that died on September the 11th every year. That's these numbers. In the past 6 years, Colombia has suffered close to 9,000 attacks of terror and violence. This is more than all the attacks of terror in the rest of the world combined. Nearly 300 small towns and villages were attacked by guerrillas and illegal right-wing groups. Approximately 2 million people, more than 3 times the population of even Baltimore, 40% of which are children, have been forcibly displaced over the past 10 years under pressure from violent groups. And these are just a few examples. Fortunately, these breathtaking statistics of human suffering have met with the resilience of the Colombian people. Resilience that is best portrayed by the slogans in the spontaneous marches for peace after the bomb at a club in Bogota, where people basically said, Colombia weeps, but it does not surrender. Colombia has a long history of violence, but it also has a long tradition of resilience and of standing up to powerful enemies. Despite the terror of the narco wars of the 80s, we were able to dismantle totally the Medellin and the Cali cartels. And now, once more, in the wake of terror, Colombians are showing their resilience and their desire to live in peace. Despite the challenges posed by the security situation, the country is at a moment of reckoning and is committed to defeating those that want to intend to destroy it. People stand firmly behind President Uribe. His popularity hovers around 80%, and his policies to defeat the illegal groups that have hijacked our security and our country. Colombians are as determined as ever to reclaim it, and we will. The government's strategy to reclaim the country from violent actors is based on important lessons learned in the years we have been forced to deal with these groups. The latest lesson comes from a failed peace process with the largest insurgent group. A little over 4 years ago, a nation hungry for an end to violence elected President Andrés Pastrana on a platform of peace. Pastrana was bold and audacious in his quest to deliver on his campaign promise. He granted the FARC a demilitarized zone to help further peace talks. The FARC only used the area to increase their attacks on society. The FARC's increased strength led to more and more violence in Colombia, and in turn began to demand a stronger hand against violent groups. Groups such as FARC were no longer considered to have any sort of social agenda, but one capriciously set on the use of terror against civilians. Apart from our experience with the FARC, Colombia has learned a lot in its fight against violence. It has learned that violence breeds violence, that war and organized crime breed when the state is weak, and that inequality and lack of opportunities generate social conflict. And above all, we have learned that law and order are more than theoretical imperatives. They are necessary conditions for democracy and development. We have come to understand that the exercise of democratic authority is the only way to ensure national freedom and prosperity for all Colombians. President Uribe has a broad mandate from the Colombian people. His administration's priority is first and foremost to ensure the free exercise of their rights to all Colombian citizens. This is the key principle behind his administration's democratic security policy. It is a policy thought out to guarantee the basic rights and freedoms of all Colombians. It is a security policy that goes beyond military strategy and keeps in mind that in order to win a war, governments must be able to deliver on a variety of fronts. I'm happy to say that in the first 17 months since President Uribe came into office, we have made significant strides in the quest to recover security and to return to the path of economic growth. While we'll still have a long ways to go, I believe that in many respects, we have turned the corner. Before I go into the numbers, it is important to note that broad-based cooperation from the U.S. under the umbrella of Plan Colombia has been instrumental to the results achieved so far. Under this bipartisan program, Colombia commits $2 for every $1 provided by the U.S. assistance. Since fiscal year 2000 and through fiscal year 2004, Colombia will have received nearly $3.5 billion in U.S. aid in the form of military equipment and training, intelligence gathering materials, judicial capacity building, social and economic development programs, among others. I don't want to burden you with too many figures, but last year saw important advances in most security indicators in Colombia. For example, in 2003, the number of homicides in the country dropped 20%, yielding the lowest rate per 100,000 inhabitants since 1987. Kidnappings were down more than 26% on the numbers of the year 2002, while terrorist attacks on the Colombian population and the country's infrastructure dropped by 48%. There were also important advances in the fight against terrorist organizations, both guerrillas and illegal self-defense groups. A total of 6,900 members of guerrilla organizations were captured during the year 2003, an increase of 85% over the year 2002. In addition, 3,100 members of illegal self-defense groups were captured in the year 2003, a 133% increase over the previous year. Similarly, 1,800 members of guerrilla organizations and 1,700 members of illegal self-defense groups demobilized in the past year. On the illegal crop front, as of July of 2003, spraying and manual eradication had reduced the extension of coca crops by 58% from their peak in December of 2000. And 114 tons of coca were seized by Colombian military and law enforcement officials, 20% more than in the previous year. Also encouragingly, the Colombian economy has begun to reflect the greater levels of confidence prevailing in the country. GDP growth at 3.6% was the highest since 1995. The growth rate, excluding illegal crops, was almost 4%, and unemployment fell from 15.6% in December of 2002 to 12.3% the year after. As I mentioned before, U.S. cooperation has been instrumental for achieving these results. For obvious reasons, media headlines normally concentrate on the military side of the bilateral relationship. What is less well known, however, is that trade has been a key part of the equation all along. The U.S. and the Colombian government see eye to eye in their conviction that the only way to make security improvements sustainable in the long run and to attack poverty, neglect, and other root causes of violence and crime is to dramatically improve economic opportunity for millions of Colombians. Over the past 15 years, the economic relationship between Colombia and the United States has changed dramatically. This began in 1990, when Colombia implemented a series of unilateral free market reforms, lowering import tariffs, liberalizing vast sectors of the economy, removing foreign exchange restrictions, and stabilizing a more open foreign investment regime. Then in 1992, Colombia and its Andean neighbors enacted a trade preference program with the United States known as the Andean Trade Preferences Act that lowered barriers for Colombian and Andean goods entering the U.S. market. As a result of these developments, U.S.-Colombian trade doubled from $5 billion in the early 90s to over $10 billion last year. The U.S. emerged as Colombia's most important trading partner, accounting for over 41% of our country's total global trade. And Colombia became U.S.'s third largest trading partner in the Western Hemisphere outside of NAFTA. As the Colombian economy recovers, President Uribe is looking for ways to enhance our long-term economic and political security. Last year, he proposed a bold new initiative to President Bush. He asked that Colombia and the United States negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement in 2004. In November, the United States announced it would formally begin negotiations with Colombia and possibly other Andean markets this year to create this free trade partnership. Such an agreement would fortify and expand an already considerable trading relationship with a country like Colombia, whose economy is around 30% larger than that of Chile, or the combined CAFTA or Central American economies. Colombian-U.S. trade agreement would be more than just about tariff levels and market access. It would offer reciprocity in our bilateral commerce, providing equal treatment for both Colombian and U.S. workers, farmers, and investors. It will encourage modernization of the Colombian state, address rules of origin issues, intellectual property protections, investment rules, labor practices, legal stability, and establish a process for managing commercial disputes. Most importantly, it will create thousands of new jobs in both our countries. It will provide an environment of confidence and certainty to investors. Such an agreement could bear the fruit for decades that U.S. assistance programs have seeded over the past 3 years. A strong case can be made for completing this bilateral agreement. Colombia is a sizable market of 82 billion plus, with excellent potential for growth in both its industrial and consumer sectors. Growth that will first look north to the U.S. market is a preferred supplier and partner. Our two economies are highly complementary. For example, U.S. exports to Colombia include agricultural commodities like corn, wheat, and soybeans that we cannot grow because of geography and climate. Indeed, in Colombia is the largest importer of U.S. grains outside of NAFTA, and industrial goods and machinery needed to support our own progress up the development ladder. American service companies will be able to partner with Colombian firms across a wider range of business areas. Likewise, Colombia's exports to the United States include natural resources like oil and coal, energy exports not subject to the volatility of Middle East politics, and products like fresh flowers, coffee, bananas, and tropical fruits not grown in the United States. Colombia's vibrant apparel industry depends heavily on inputs such as cotton fabrics and yarns originating from the United States. Where the greatest opportunity for U.S. companies resides is in Colombia's mushrooming services sector. The services sector already accounts for more than 50% of Colombia's GDP, and the country is a net importer of services with purchases abroad of over $3 billion in the year 2002. In both goods and services, American corporations are at a disadvantage in Colombia vis-a-vis companies from countries like, say, Mexico or Chile that have free trade agreements with our country. In general terms, the Colombian market offers substantial opportunities for U.S. exports. Imports account for only 20% of Colombia's GDP. The same figure for similar countries is 30% for Mexico, 33% for Chile, and 44% for a country like Costa Rica. Moreover, the average Colombian tariff for U.S. goods is 9.3%, and our country levied close to $470 million in tariffs on U.S. goods in the year 2002. These costs will virtually disappear with an FTA. There also exists a vibrant investment relationship between Colombia and the United States. More than 200 American companies today operate in nearly every sector of the Colombian economy, including energy, manufacturing, telecoms, transport, agribusiness, and business and financial services. U.S. investment in Colombia totals nearly $5.7 billion, with a free trade agreement providing a sound foundation for future economic integration. No doubt more American companies will look to Colombia to explore new business opportunities. The Colombia-U.S. agreement will meet the fundamental test of what any trade negotiation should strive to achieve. That is, remove barriers to trade and investment that currently exist in both markets and significantly expand commercial relationships, cross-border investment, and employment. And it will further strengthen a Colombia-U.S. partnership based on the shared values of promoting democracy, free market economic policies, and fighting terrorism and drug trafficking. Beyond the trade and investment benefits of an agreement, an FTA with the United States will promote security and stability in Colombia and its Andean neighbors, enhancing broader U.S. strategic interests in the region. Colombia and the U.S. have together invested significant resources in recent years to defeat violent terrorist groups that thrive on illegal drug cultivation and trafficking. We have dramatic results to show for this investment. Coca production was reduced, as I said before, by 58% between the year December of 2000 and July of 2003. But Colombia must now create jobs for tens of thousands of peasant families who formerly cultivated illegal coca. Expanding trade is key to doing this. Growth, jobs, progress. This sums up in just a few words why Colombia and the U.S. are embarking in a free trade negotiation and what we both expect to achieve in the years ahead as it is completed and implemented. Let me just end by saying that we do not have false pretenses over the difficulty or the challenges facing our country. But we are encouraged by the progress and by the mood in our country. We feel we are turning a corner and that we have been able to get there in large part due to U.S. support. The current context is unique. Not only does the government have unprecedented domestic support, but at the same time, our partnership with the United States has made resources more readily available and served to better equip and train our forces. This combination is bound to continue to show increasing tangible results in the months to come. In a time where U.S. action abroad is sometimes brought into question, Colombia provides a case study of success in the war against terrorism. Your country's assistance to Colombia is both well received by Colombians and has proved effective in reducing violence and restoring economic growth. We are proud to be an ally of the United States and hope to continue working together towards enhanced security and broader prosperity in our hemisphere. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take all your questions.
The question is, how homegrown is the drug industry?
Well, I can tell you it didn't come from France. But cocaine was really indigenous to Bolivia and Peru. It was the Indians in those countries that used to chew coca, basically to walk for hours and hours, and was a form of feeding themselves. In fact, as you know, coca has been used for centuries, for many, even for medicinal purposes. What really changed this equation was a combination of things. Definitely, this is a demand-driven kind of problem. And as you recall, in the 80s, it was a big thing in Hollywood to use cocaine. And it was a big thing in many places in America and in Europe. And it was fashionable. And it's very easy to transport when you think about that this country uses maybe anywhere from 300 to 400 tons of cocaine every year. When you think about it, it's not that difficult to transport those volumes. And what you found was criminal entrepreneurs, as we have never seen, that basically came about in Colombia. A geographic location of our country where you have basically two oceans, the Pacific and the Caribbean. A possibility of entering the U.S. market through either Central America, Mexico, or directly through Haiti and other countries. And with a combination of ships and even into the retailing side of the United States that permitted this boom to take place. Making cocaine is not as simple as simply a cocaine leaf. If you take a leaf, you must apply a number of chemicals from gasoline, ether, potassium permanganate. All of these chemicals are used to finally extract the HCl content of a cocaine leaf. And this represents, in terms of environmental damage alone, the equivalent of almost 1 Exxon Valdez every year and a half in Colombia, of which these chemicals are thrown to the rivers. Not to mention the fact that the places where they typically grow the coca are in areas of our country that are basically frontier lands, an area the size of the state of Texas, which has been basically home to the highest biodiversity in the world, but not only the highest biodiversity, but the best water availability, because it's very much a part of the Amazon basin. And for every hectare or acre of coca that is planted, 3 acres of rainforest are destroyed. This is, making cocaine is not a very difficult, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's just a question of extracting from the leaf the HCl content made into a paste, and then that's dried up through basically microwave oven. So it's not a very complicated, this is not rocket science to make. The criminal entrepreneurship of this is, of course, remarkable, and it takes a huge effort on our government. We spend roughly about $1.5 billion every year fighting this problem from every regard. And this is a country that has seen tax revenues, when you add up everything, close to $20 billion a year. Think for a minute if you could use that same money to invest in the social safety net of our country, which Colombia, like most developing countries, has some very dire needs. So this is a huge problem to our society, and the cost is very, very large.
Haiti's in the middle of a circulation of drugs, but the question ends up being, why didn't Colombia, Haiti, and the United States do something about the upheaval in Haiti, which displaced Mr. Aristide? So the question to you is, why didn't Colombia do something about Haiti?
Well, as you can imagine, we have plenty of problems, but No, let me say to that a number of things. First of all, and this is not because I'm here, the ambassador, but you would ask any government, U.S. government official, they would tell you that the best cooperation that exists with any country in the fight on drugs is with Colombia. I mean, we have tremendous skills that have been developed, which have permitted Colombia to really curb many of the trafficking organizations. When you think that last year alone, 120 tons of coca never left the country, it tells you a lot about what our law enforcement is doing. Now, to successfully fight the war on drugs, and especially the transportation of them, it requires international cooperation. If you have governments that are not cooperating or don't have the strength of cooperation that you need, well, traffickers are going to quickly use those routes. Mexico has done a tremendous amount lately in the last number of years, because increasingly Mexico has been used as a kind of a transit place to enter the United States, as have other Central American countries, as have some Caribbean islands. And every time people see a little break in the law enforcement system, they will use whatever hole they can find. So the answer to your question is it requires international cooperation, constantly, determined, and all the time. I cannot speak to the specific issues of Haiti. I would leave to their ambassador. They have plenty of problems of their own, which I don't want to get into.
This is not a new suggestion, but the question is, can you geographically get rid of some of your problems?
It's like you want another Louisiana Purchase here, but no. No, I see your point, but let me, these are, two things on that. You are right in that, geographically speaking, Colombia is about the size of Texas and California combined to kind of picture the size of the country, 44 million people. It is no different than, let's say, the U.S. in the 19th century, where most of your population was in the Eastern Shore. In that regard, you're right. And you had frontier lands, and you had a boom. That boom was all about gold. Ours, unfortunately, has not been exactly about gold, but it's been more about cocaine. Those areas in the south of Colombia where you had, let's say, an area the size of the state of Texas, where you have no more than 4% of the population, are areas that have huge potential in natural resources, in biodiversity. As you look forward and in the years to come, countries with high biodiversity are going to be hugely important for the development of all kinds of organic medicines, for the use of water in many regards. Water will become, over the years, a huge scarce product. So you can't renounce on having that piece of property that was given by history. On the contrary, I think the effort that we have been doing is precisely to do exactly what the United States did in the 19th century, was to begin to provide for more government presence and state presence in those areas. And as we do that, the situation is turning in favor of the government. And little by little, we have been in this campaign of territorial control. About 18 months ago, there were roughly 20% of the counties in the country all concentrated in this area that basically had no government presence. Today they do. And as you get there, right behind, you will come with government services and a basic social safety net where people can basically make a life. So the answer is, it is not that you apply all law enforcement, it's that you got to apply law enforcement in a relentless way against terrorists. Otherwise, you will never win.
Well, would you compare apples and oranges? Would you compare the method of military force in Colombia against dealing with the need for drugs, i.e. legalization of drugs in the United States?
This is
Comment on those two methods.
Yeah, I mean, a country like Colombia really has no choice. The reality is that legalization will not fix a number of problems. It will fix perhaps the criminal side of the equation, but the health issues related to coca will remain the same. And the other issue for practical purposes is I can tell you I spend a lot of my time going to Capitol Hill. I have yet to see a member of Congress willing to go to the floor of the Senate or the House to advocate legalization without being voted out of office the year after he made this speech. There was, in fact, I think, a mayor of Baltimore who advocated legalization. He's no longer mayor. There was a governor in the state of New Mexico who, after he was term limited, advocated legalization, but only when he was term limited. You go to Europe, where you have more left of center parliaments, and you don't find that legalization really has made any big inroads. So for a country like Colombia, this becomes a theoretic discussion. For us, the equation is different in this regard. It is the drugs that are driving the violence. It is that illicit profit that is using monies to fund people who are going against civilians and innocent people in our country. And the only way they will finish is the day we finish with the production of drugs. And in this regard, this is why we are relentless in this fight. We have paid the worst price of this fight in Colombia. We have lost presidential candidates. We have lost half of our Supreme Court at one moment. We have lost journalists. We have lost some of our best people, not to mention all the law enforcement people. And the worst thing that you could do is that at the end of the battle, you give in.
The follow-up question was, did you in fact say that the legalization of drugs did not result in a diminution of crime where tried?
What I was referring to is the fact that it is, for the most part, countries and parliaments in many countries have not really been able to move on providing for legalization. And I agree with you entirely that there is a very clear connection between drugs and crime, as is manifested in the inner cities in the United States, and as is manifested in our country. What you are speaking about is there's perhaps in 2 or 3, maybe 2 cities in Europe that I can remember, where they have isolated a part of the city where people, if they want to use drugs, they can use all the drugs they want. But that in itself has not meant necessarily a reduction in those areas, where in these cities. And for that reason, there's been a lot of question of this practice. But that's about it. I mean, the reality is that legalization of drugs that I know of has really not taken hold any place in the world.
How much of your drug production is used locally?
It's a good way to review. Absolutely. In our country, we have about 1 million users of drugs, and we have a drug problem, and a very serious one. And therefore, for us, it's very important to reduce that consumption as well. We constantly do campaigns to try to reduce the consumption of drugs in Colombia.
Would you comment on the nature of the cooperation between our drug enforcement authorities and yours?
Well, basically, you have representation of DA agents and DA as a whole in Colombia. They work hand in hand and been working hand in hand for many years. When there is intelligence that comes about a certain organization, either developed by Colombian forces or, for that matter, by U.S., because there's cases that have been developed in the United States, we quickly go or they quickly go, the Colombian forces, and try to take them out. When cases are developed about trafficking organizations in Colombia, we have an extradition treaty with the United States. And if they are found guilty and approved by our courts, they will be extradited to the United States. To give you an idea, I think over the last 16 months, we've authorized extraditions of about 120 extraditions, mostly Colombian citizens. So there's a very strong judicial cooperation, and of course, regarding to the whole law enforcement side of it as well.
two comments asked of you. That is the very aggressive policy against the FARC and what might the demise of their leadership have on it.
And I think she was making also a comparison to Peru, where there was a group called Shining Path, and where basically then President Fujimori basically crashed all of this group. In Colombia, there's about 30,000 combatants, including FARC, AUC, and ELN. I think it's very difficult to pretend to, for any government, to find a solution by trying to eliminate all these people. I think the job of any government is to guarantee the life and security of its citizens. But I think at the same time, if these groups, especially the rank and file of these groups, are willing to demobilize, like many of them have already been demobilized in the past year, I think the government should find a way to reinsert them into Colombian society, and we are doing some of that. There are other people who have committed serious crimes that have no choice but to go to Colombian jails, and some are going to Colombian jails. In the meantime, the government has no choice, if these groups are not willing to negotiate, for the government to continue to pursue its goal of having a position of strength, and eventually I think they'll find themselves in a situation where you need a political solution. Why? Because this is the way to bring in many people who are part of the rank and file, who have been conscripted into these groups in a forceful way without really having any other opportunities, because they were situations that, of poverty or whatever, where are some of these people that can be saved. And, this is not different than what happened in Central America. Making peace in these situations is always very difficult, but I think it's the goal of the Colombian society, and people, I think, are ready to pardon as long as it is a definite solution.
The comment has been made that much of the drug money is invested in Europe. The question is, what assistance do European governments give to Colombia and the United States in this effort?
The reality is that a kilo of cocaine is like $30,000 to $40,000 in the streets of the U.S., and is less than a tenth of that in Colombia. Of course, the money stays, let's say, up the value chain or up the distribution stream, and mostly in those organizations that are basically taking that cocaine to the streets and selling them. A lot has been done in money laundering laws throughout the world. A lot has been done in this country. In the case of the European cooperation with Colombia, it's never been at the levels of the U.S. cooperation with Colombia. I think Europeans do not see this problem with the same seriousness Americans do. The reality is that increasingly there is a bigger drug problem in Europe, and the U.S. has little by little managed to decrease the consumption of cocaine and other types of drugs for that matter. This, the best, there's never a magic formula. It has to be done consistently, has to be done in the schools, at the level of the families. One, as a parent, have to watch very carefully your kids. But in the ways of trafficking, I think increasingly there's more and more international cooperation. And there's a Basel type, there's a major laws that were developed in Basel, where basically a lot of governments subscribe by and a lot of the regulators look after, and there's elements into money laundering that are closely watched.
Is there much regional cooperation?
This is a very important question. Clearly, as we are successful in Colombia, the likelihood of this problem spreading to other countries is very big. If you watch lately the numbers of hectares or acres under production in the Andean countries, namely Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, they basically, Peru and Bolivia have basically stayed the same, and the big reduction has been taking place in Colombia. And you would ask yourself, well, why hasn't there been a bigger pickup in the other countries? And the answer could be, one, There's high levels of productivity in Colombia. Maybe there's stocks of cocaine that were around, and therefore you are still not seeing the impact. But the regional cooperation is a fundamental element of what we do. We reach out to our neighbors continuously. The last thing you want is your neighbor to have much of this tragedy to happen in their country. And for that matter, the U.S. assistance is increasingly to also the bordering countries of Colombia.
The general question, I think, is would you comment on the report of the Council on Foreign Relations, and especially the last observation that current U.S. policy on drugs isn't going to contribute to successful promotion of democracy?
Two quick answers. What I was suggesting here, which is really the facts in terms of reduction, is that even though the areas under cultivation in both Peru and Bolivia have pretty much remained the same, and the significant drop in Colombia, maybe the output has not really been affected, and part of that, like I was saying before, is because of more productivity. Before, maybe they are getting now as many as 5 crops, sometimes 4.5 crops a year out of the same area. So that explains part of it. The other part of it could be explained by stocks of cocaine that were held before and you haven't seen them, and therefore the output of product could be the same, and you have not seen yet the decrease. And we'll see a lot of the effects of that, I think, this year. Secondly, in terms of displaced people, it all depends, how you take statistics, but I don't think I've never seen, and I have questioned the Council on Foreign Relations on that very statistic. It is true that, first of all, let me say that 25% of Colombia's population are Afro-Colombians, and unfortunately, in the unaffiliated areas, in many remote areas of the countries where most of this population is concentrated. As a result, where there is violence, they have been impacted the most, and this is true. And this is a very serious problem, and we're, of course, working very closely because they are part of the areas of the country where there's the most poverty. In 25% of this population, the income per capita is roughly $500, as opposed to $2,200 for the country as an average. So this is a very serious problem. The report, I think, looks more in a long-term period of time, as you know, more like a 10-year period. And it makes a case for changing the mix in the U.S. support to the Andean countries. And it basically looks at things like agricultural reform and others. I agree and disagree with some parts of the report, and I respect very much their opinions, and I think it's, at the end of the day, good that reports like this come out.
What percentage of the aid goes to job encouragement and social programs? Yeah.
Of the U.S. contribution to Plan Colombia, roughly speaking, about 30% to 40%, depending on the year, goes to institutional building and to social type of programs. This will have an indirect effect on job creation, but not necessarily a direct one. The Colombian contribution to Plan Colombia is all related to social programs and programs that go directly to job creation and others. So there is, let's say, the U.S. program is highly weighted on security, but it's because it also comes with the strength that U.S. can provide in security, not only to Colombia, but to the world.
Can you estimate how much of the flow of drug money actually comes back positively into the Colombian economy?
It is very, I will tell you a measure that we have. In Colombia, we look at all agricultural production, including cocaine. Last year, the growth of the illicit economy in Colombia was 3.9%. However, the actual growth was only 3.6%. Why? Because the reduction in the size of the coca crops affected, let's say, negatively in that regard the economy. But on the other hand, what it shows is that as you are successful in reducing the size of the coca crops in Colombia, you're opening more space for the legal economy. But it's never been. I mean, I think there was a study done, I don't recall exactly how many years ago, that indicated that perhaps at the height of this, it represented about 2.5% of GDP, which is a lot. It's not what people would think off their tops of their head, that maybe, you know, this is an economy driven by drugs, but 2% of any economy in the hands of illegal business is very big.
How sophisticated is the weaponry of the insurgents?
I would say it's traditional insurgency. Fortunately, what you suggest is not there. I mean, the sophisticated surface-to-air missiles and all of those things are not there yet, but they use conventional guerrilla tactics, and very effective ones. You know, at the end of the day, you know, acting by surprise and in a cowardly way like they normally do is a very important tool of fighting.
How much of your labor is to try to encourage American exports via specifically Export-Import Bank credits?
I just wish that you repeated the first part, but anyways, I hope everybody heard it. I couldn't do as good a job as you did with that introduction. It makes me happy that...
But you don't run a travel agency, though.
No, this is pulp and paper.
No, I know.
But yes, we do keep in touch with Exim Bank. In fact, I'm gonna see next week or the week after Phil Mayer, who is the president of Exim Bank. It's you know, it all depends what type of products. It's basically, as you know, geared towards U.S. companies wanting to finance capital exports or capital goods exports to Colombia, and I think we have a pretty big space still left. I know they did. I was aware of a large transaction that was done of about $150 to $200 million about a year and a half ago. But I mean, I don't know of any specific one, but I'd be happy to find out what we can do, and this is important for us.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, your answers have all been complete and cogent, and unfortunately, we've run out of time, but it's been a marvelous evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you.